Hello, and welcome back to this video series on data and data modeling. In this video, I'd like to cover uh, three different data models that you will see when you're doing database design. That's the conceptual data model, the logical, and the physical data model. All right, so data models. Let me skip ahead here in the slides. So there's data models and there's data modeling. So when you think about a data model, it's a communication tool that you'll use with the client. It's going to be a visual of the overall database structure. It's going to depict the various relationships between the entities. It's a way of organizing the data for various users within the database. Data modeling is it's an iterative process where we're going to go back to the domain, the problem domain, and we're going to craft something called business rules. And we'll get those business rules from the problem, a description that the client gives us. And so we're going to talk about business rules here in just a second. But again, this idea of a model is an abstraction of a real world object or event from what I've defined here in this description. And it's really, that's the biggest thing is that it's a communication tool between you and a client. And it's like I said, it's an iterative process where you'll go back and forth to refine and to specify exactly the structure of what the database should be. As you're crafting these data models, you're going to need information from the client or whoever is actually needing this database. So here are just a few different sources from where you'll get information. So company managers, if you're working in a part of an organization or a company, you'll get it from the policymakers, the department managers. It may even be just written documentation that has been compiled over the years. You may also want to consider doing some direct interviews with the end users, the folks who will be using the database. And a lot of times they're storing their data in spreadsheets. And so that's a good way to capture how they're going to use the data, because you can see how they're currently using it without a database. But once you get all of this data and you get the description from the client or these folks I just mentioned here, you're going to craft what we call business rules. And those business rules should be brief, precise, and it captures specifically it captures a specific principle that you're going to craft out in your database. And so here's a few examples of business rules. So here I have a community watch group member can submit one or more incidents. And then here's another one. An incident can be assigned multiple categories. Let me just say a few words about this first business rule. So one, we have the noun or the entity, which is a group member, or we could say a member. We have the verb, which is going to be submit. And then we have the multiplicity, one or more, or some people would say the cardinality, one or more incidents. But then the two nouns in this business rule is going to be group member, and then we have incident. And so we'll talk more about how to structure out these business rules. But in this case here, this shows kind of what we call a one direction business rule. A community watch group can submit one or more incidents. And then here's another one, an incident. We have the noun or the entity here. Assigned is the verb. And here we have the multiplicity or the cardinality, multiple categories. So again, a business rule captures a specific policy or some type of procedure or principle. And we're going to do our best to use these business rules to craft out our ERD, what we call an entity relationship diagram. So here's a few considerations that we want to adhere to when we're creating these business rules from the description. And again, here's just this kind of an overview of what we're doing. It helps standardize the company's view of data. And again, it's a communication tool between a user and a designer. But then the first step here would be to take, we want to use nouns that would translate into our entities. So as examples, and use student rather than students. Use employee rather than employees. And then the verbs translate into relationships among entities. Other thing here is that it talks about the relationship. We can have what we call bidirectional relationships. And so if we go back to this slide here, where it says a community watch group member can submit one or more incidents, that's one direction. But the other direction could be that an incident can be submitted by one or more community members. So again, one direction is that a community watch group can submit one or more incidents, and then the bidirectional would be an incident can be submitted by one or more group members. So just to reiterate, our now in this particular business rule is going to be that we'll use as member and incident, and we'll probably want to drop the S from here. And so member, incident, and then our verb is going to be submit, and then the cardinality will be one or more. So naming conventions, make sure that you're choosing entity names that reflect the business or reflect the problem domain. And then our attributes is going to be data that's going to be associated with the entities. And so if we look at, we go back to this slide here, oops, let's say group member, some attributes of a group member may be first and last name, email, address, things of that nature. And so and the question is, how do we come up with this particular entity name member? The problem domain or the actual description is that this is a community watch group. And so there could be many different members a part of this community watch group. All right, so let's talk about 3 different types of data models that you will encounter. One is called a conceptual data model. And then you have the logical data model, physical, and then you'll also hear something called the internal data model. Now, the conceptual data model is a very high level depiction of the relationship between entities. It doesn't get specifically into what attributes are associated with each entity. The logical design, it's a lower level. It's still abstract, but it depicts the relationships. It goes a little bit further and depict the various attributes and begins to define, you may even define what type of data each attribute consists of. And so here on this next slide, you'll see an example of a conceptual data model. Again, we're just worried about the entity names. In this case here, we have student, we have enroll, professor, class, room, and course, but we don't necessarily define the various attributes associated with a student. So a conceptual model also depicts the relationship between entities. And so in this case here, what this is saying is that a student can enroll in one or more classes, and a class can be taken by or can be enrolled in by a class is taken by one or more students. Now you're saying, well, you skip this enroll entity, and this here is specifically called an associative entity that holds the relationship between student and class. If we don't have this associative entity of enroll, you'll see that there's no way to hold the relationship between student and class, because this represents a many-to-many relationship, which we'll talk a little bit later. So when we have a conceptual model, that helps us design the logical model. And so here's just a few different types of ER models. The one that we'll primarily use is the crow's foot notation, but there is the chin notation, which they're all ERD or entity relationship diagrams but there's some things that the Chin model can notate that the crow's foot diagram cannot notate, and vice versa. And then you also have the UML class diagram. So these are 3 different models that you would find when you're doing database design, or when you're creating these data models. As I mentioned, creating this data model is an iterative process. And so you will have the information sources, whether they're the company managers, doing the direct interviews. You're going to craft these business rules. You may want to do some things called DFD, which is data flow diagrams, how data flows in and out of the system. You may have some process maps and how things actually function and operate. From that, you're going to craft your ERD diagram. You're going to go through the process of normalization, and that's going to inform your data dictionary. But by doing all of these designs and creating these various models, you're going to end up with a conceptual data model. And then from the conceptual data model, that should lead you into the logical data model, which is a little bit, it's not a high level abstract data. It goes a little bit lower in defining specifically what the physical data model will actually consist of. So here's an example of a logical data model, and it's a lower level of abstraction. So you'll see that now we have the attributes associated with the entities. In this case here, we're depicting 3 different entities. We have property, we have amenity, and then we have our associative entity that's going to hold the relationship between property and amenity, and that's going to be prop amen list. Then for each entity, we are defining the various attributes. And so if we were to read this out, it would say a property is associated with 1 or more amenities, and then an amenity can be associated with 1 property. And so in our next video, we're going to talk about the various pieces of ERD diagram. So we'll talk about what this represents, what the cardinality represents, and some of it I already made mention of, but we'll get specifically into how to craft an ERD diagram. So stay tuned.